Yeah, today we're going to actually dive into the text. I put up on the board, there's different ways that you could outline this book. I would say the very broad outline is the rise of David, then there's a turning point where he sins grievously, and then the fall of David, right? Within that, though, I mean, again, there's different ways that you could do this, but this is kind of David's rise as to become king. I gave chapter 7 its own line because, as I said last week, it's so critical, not just with this narrative, but with the understanding of Jesus. I mean, you could make an argument that this is the most important chapter in the entire Old Testament, at least in terms of understanding Jesus and how people in Jesus's day understood what he was about. So can't stress the importance of 2 Samuel 7 enough. Then there's some chapters about David conquering some more, kind of his success as king. Then his transgressions, that leads to troubles within his house, which leads to an open rebellion of his son and civil war. And then eventually David is restored to the throne. Then these last chapters are appendix stories. They actually don't fit in the chronology of the book. They're stories that are added on to the very end of the scroll or the text. So they're not meant to be chronological. The story ends here, and then these are stories from David and even a story about Saul. And we'll talk about that in the last time that we meet. There's a kind of a structure to those stories and a message that kind of goes with all of those, but it's an appendix. It's not a or a not really an epilogue. I would say more of an appendix. It's stories. So if you're reading chapter 20, then all of a sudden you get to 21 and you're like, wait a minute, I thought we passed that. Or why is Saul alive again? It's because it's not meant to be chronological. They were added on to the end of the scroll as appendix stories. So we'll talk about that when we get there. But this is just kind of a broad outline. I'll just keep it up there because I think it's helpful to just kind of have an idea of the overall. But like I said, if you're looking at the very broad outline, David's rise, turning point where he sins, David's fall, and then the appendix. So I put up here too, remember too, that we can situate David's reign. It was 1010 BC to 790. He reigned for 40 years, and we'll say that in the text that we cover tonight. So it's easy to remember David when he lived, because he reigned exactly 1,000 years before Christ. So that was the time period that we're talking about. And then also I'm going to leave the map up here because I think the map is helpful. And we're going to be talking about battles and geography and stuff like that, and to have some idea. Every map, you make choices about what different maps are showing. This map does a good job of showing. This is actually from Wikipedia, by the way. It was the best map that I found. This is good stuff. And it shows all the towns and most of the towns that are mentioned. What it doesn't show you is it doesn't show you the topography of the Holy Land. So here you have a very mountainous region, the hill country of Judea, Jerusalem, which is a stronghold, which we'll talk about. Then here, it's a very deep valley. The Dead Sea is the lowest point in the world. So you go from, and I went on a bus, you go from on a mountain basically to the lowest point in the world, and it is pretty much straight down from Jerusalem to the Dead Sea. Here is the hill country of Judea, and then it kind of gradually, there's kind of a series of valleys that are kind of in this hill country that eventually kind of slopes into the plains in Philistia, which is where the Philistines are located, modern day Gaza. Then you get up to we're not going to be talking as much about the north, but that you've got what will eventually be Samaria, and then, the north. But anyway, that's the topography. Oh, and I don't know if I mentioned, but there's a big valley right around the Jordan River as well. So in Jesus's day, if you were making a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, often they would go in the Jordan Valley and then go up to Jerusalem. The Psalms talk about, we go up to Jerusalem because you literally had to go up to go to Jerusalem. So anyway, this map doesn't show that, but there are plenty of other maps that do. However, the map that I'm going to keep it on, this shows a united kingdom of Israel, but I'm going to keep it on this map, which is the tribal map. Because as I was explaining to some of you just now, this is always has to be in the background of our minds when we're thinking about these events that are going on, because the people of this day this was your tribe, this was your state, to put it into our terms, right? And just like how we're very aware that we're in Montana and not Texas or California, the tribal government is the way, a confederation of tribes is the way that they organize themselves. And so they're very aware of this. So, we're going to focus a lot on Judah because that's the tribe of David. That's where the Jews come from. We talked about that also. All Jews are Israelites, not all Israelites are Jews. And then we have the other 10 tribes. Saul's tribe, if you remember, was the tribe of Benjamin, which was a tiny tribe, both in terms of land and in terms of people, because of a story that happens in Judges that I won't go into, but it's one of the more brutal stories in the Bible. And then so I'll keep it on this map just because even though we're going to get to a united kingdom under David, we need to keep this in mind. With the exception of Dan, remember the tribe of Dan in Judges, that's where Samson was from, the tribe of Dan, right next to Philistia. A significant group of Dan moved up to the north, and they named a city Dan. So Dan basically moved from here to up there. Okay, so Dan was the very far north of the Holy Land. So I'll keep it, like I said, I'll keep it here just because this is something that we'll keep in mind. All right, well let's get into the text. By the way, just in case you're curious, I am using the Revised Standard Version Catholic Edition, Second Catholic Edition. So you certainly don't have to use that translation. In fact, the more translations that we have, the better, because no translation in English is perfect. Some are better than others, but in any translation, the translators have to choose a kind of philosophy of translation to make choices about how they're going to translate, and you can't avoid that. The only way to, resolve that issue is to learn ancient Hebrew, which is really hard. So it's actually okay. Now, that's not to say all translations are created equal. Some are very poor, right? But no translation is perfect. And it's actually good. I have a number of different translations on my shelf, not because, they're all of equal value or merit, but because it is good, especially if you're getting hung up on word choice and word syntax, to try to have a different, look at different translations, to look at different words. The one that we use at Mass is the NABRE, New American Bible Revised Edition. Again, there's pros and cons to it. So, but it is important for us as American Catholics because we use it in the liturgy. So, that's what you'll hear with these readings. All right. Okay. So let's get into 2 Samuel chapter 1. Remember that this is a little bit of an arbitrary starting point in that this is one book, Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel. However, it's not arbitrary in that Saul has just died, and we are now going to, see David's rise to power. And my goal for tonight is we'll just cover the first 6 chapters. We'll cover David's rise, and then next week we'll get into the Davidic covenant, that really important chapter 7. Okay. All right. So, and just to refresh you, remember, Saul died by falling on his own sword. Okay, so that's what we just read if we were reading, all right, so 2 Samuel chapter 1. After the death of Saul, when David had returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag. And on the 3rd day, behold, a man came from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and earth upon his head. Okay, first of all, the Amalekites are down here, okay? This is one thing that we would have read if we were reading 1 Samuel, okay, and this is important detail, is remember, this was the people, Israel had a lot of different enemies when they were trying to conquer this land, but the Amalekites were one of the more aggressive thorns in their side. And at one point in Saul's career, really important story for Saul in a bad way, God tells Saul, you're going to go to war with Amalek, the Amalekites. You need to wipe them out. Do not let anybody live, and do not take any booty from Amalek. Saul is like, he defeats them, and then he's like, well, maybe I could compromise, right? I could take some of the treasure and distribute it to the generals and lords who helped me, and also, I'm going to keep their king alive, even though he was a really bad dude, right? And maybe I could hold him for ransom, something like that. Samuel finds out about this. Samuel comes in and says, Saul, what are you doing? Why did you not listen to God? And Saul's trying to make excuses and that kind of thing. Samuel comes in and he says to Saul, he says, because you've abandoned God, God has abandoned your house. And from that point on, right, God says, you're done, Saul. That's it. And then Samuel ends up killing the Amalekite king himself. What the Amalekites, so remember, and I probably should have left this on the board because this is just really important when we're studying Scripture. Remember, there's the two senses of Scripture: the literal and the spiritual. And they're both true at the same time, and you can break up the spiritual more. We won't do that now, but you can break it up into different levels. But we read Scripture on both levels. So there was a battle with Saul against the Amalekites, but remember too, and this is part of the nature of how Scripture was crafted, is the editors and redactors of it are also looking back on the history and understanding God's relationship to his people through these stories. They see God acting in these stories. So while there was a literal battle with the Amalekites where Saul was supposed to wipe them out completely and did not, the Amalekites come to represent kind of pure evil that you don't compromise with. Things like and if we're going to put this into a spiritual plane, certain sins and evils that there's no negotiating with, right? The murder and abuse of the innocent, or something like abortion, right? Like we can't compromise on abortion, and we can't say like, well, maybe in some cases we could do it, right? No, we have to cut that out, right? There's no compromise. And the Amalekites come to take on that symbolic weight of like the kind of evil that you don't mess with. Okay, why that is? Well, I mean, they were a historical enemy of Israel, but the and this is just kind of an aside. These people that the Israelites were conquering, they weren't just innocent nomads, right? They were pagans, but they were idolaters. They also, though, the Canaanites were pretty notorious for things like child sacrifice, right? And other brutal practices. So, part of it is God's judgment on them too, right? It's not just like they were sitting around peaceful people. It's like part of it is that's going on too. Now, it's the story's not told from their perspective. It's told from the story of the Israelite perspective. But it's not like they're just innocent people just sitting around. They were not only pagans and idolaters, but they had some very evil practices, right? That you can't tolerate. And so that's part of the kind of symbolic value that the Amalekites take on. Okay, so anyway, that's going to be important here, these first couple chapters. Just think, literally the Amalekites are people who live in this area, but spiritually they take on this weight, even in this text, about like, evil that you don't compromise with, okay? So the death of Saul, it's even though I said that this division is a bit arbitrary, in some ways it's not, because the death of a major figure is also the beginning of the book of Joshua, Moses, okay? And it's also the beginning of the book, or I put Deuteronomy, Judges. It's also the beginning of the book of Judges, is the death of Joshua. So you got, Joshua starts with the death of Moses. Judges starts with the death of Joshua. So there is a kind of theme here, as far as the death of a major figure. And in ancient times, you didn't mark the times by, well, you certainly didn't mark it 1,000 years before Christ, right? But like they marked it based on who the rulers were, because it was an easy way, in the 14th reign of so and so, whatever, So the death of a major figure is a natural way to mark time. Okay. And by the way, the Saul's failure to annihilate the Amalekites was in 1 Samuel 15. Okay, and that was a major event that led to God abandoning Saul in favor of David. Okay, so and remember, and the other thing too, and this is again the kind of end of 1 Samuel. David remained 2 days in Ziklag. Okay, Ziklag is somewhere right here. It's not on this map, but it's on the border of Philistia and Israel, or Judah. Okay, and basically part of the end of 1 Samuel 1, another story that led right up into this, is the Amalekites, in part because Saul didn't wipe them out, had raided Ziklag, okay, and kidnapped many of the townspeople, including 2 of David's wives, okay? Because remember, David is from Judah, so he's hanging out in Judah. Part of the reason why David is also hanging out near the Philistine border is because that's how bad Saul is to David, right? David, and the Philistines are no friend of David and the Israelites, but David actually feels more safe closer to the Philistines than he does near Saul. So Ziklag is a town along this border, and the Amalekites, because Saul didn't wipe them out, they end up raiding Ziklag. They kidnap 2 of David's wives, okay? And, so not good, okay? And as I said, the whole reason he's on the Philistine border is because he's being pursued and harassed by Saul. So this is to say, this is how bad Saul's corruption has become, and David seeking a kind of refuge with the Philistines. Well, in 1 Samuel 30, David avenges his family and countrymen by striking the Amalekites, by freeing his kidnapped kinsmen from Ziklag, okay? So that's where David is along this border, and he's doing, by the way, what Saul did not do, which is wipe out the Amalekites. So again, showing that where Saul fails, David does his job. Okay. Now, so that's where David is. He's remained for 2 days in Ziklag. That's a backstory because we didn't read 1 Samuel. Okay. So as I said, on the 3rd day, a man from the camp with clothes torn and earth upon his head. And when he came to David, this is verse 2. When he came to David, he fell to the ground and did obeisance. David said to him, "Where do you come from?" And he said to him, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." And David said to him, "How did it go? Tell me." And he answered, "The people have fled from the battle, and many of the people have also fallen and died. And Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead." Another thing to situate us, Mount Gilboa, which is where that battle took that Saul fell at, is right up here. Okay, it's in the northern part of Israel. So, in this time, obviously, they don't have text messaging or, cameras at the war scene, So obviously, news has to travel by messenger, and it's not as fast. So this messenger, the fact that his clothes are torn, he has earth on his head, right, is a sign of distress. I mean, he's been, running from, now to go from Mount Gilboa to Jerusalem, I know from like Galilee to Jerusalem is about 2.5 hours by bus. Okay. So imagine, how many days that would take, like maybe a week if you're fast, right? Yeah. Anyway, so the young man, so that's, but David wants proof. Okay. Then verse 5, then David says to the young man who told him, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" So David's obviously like, "Okay, well, prove it to me, right? How do you know that?" And so the young man is going to tell his version of the story. And the young man who told him said, "By chance, I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning upon his spear. And behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me. And I answered, 'Here I am.' And he said to me, 'Who are you?' I answered him, 'I am an Amalekite.'" So we just learned about this guy's identity, right? He's an Amalekite. Keep that in mind, okay? "And he said to me, 'Stand beside me and slay me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers.' So I stood beside him and slew him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown on which was on his head, and the armlet which was on his arm, and I have brought him here to my Lord." So, as I said, Mount Gilboa, okay, is up here. That's where he was, okay? Now, the first thing that's a little ridiculous about this story is he's like, "Yeah, I just happened to be going by Mount Gilboa," okay? Like, there's 2 major armies in the area going to battle, okay? Like, you're not just happening to go on. What's most likely is this guy was scavenging, right? Trying to get loot off the dead, right? And he happened to come upon Saul. And he's also an Amalekite. He's obviously trying to win favor with David. But remember, okay, literally, he's an Amalekite. But also remember, too, this is the guy who's part of the people that, like, you don't compromise with. them, right? They are evil, okay? So he assumes, and rightly so in a certain sense, that David is a rival who would want Saul dead. And so he must have found Saul before the Philistines, obviously, because Saul's still alive. He finds him, and then he brings his crown and his armlet as proof that he found Saul. And David would have recognized these things. So not only does he have a story, but he also has some proof to back it up. And he's trying to make himself look good, right? Hey, I defeated your rival, and here's the crown. There you go, right? And then David, oh, come on, join my court, and you can be a part of my gang now, right? Okay. So what does David do? Verse 11, then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. I mean, what a different reaction than this is not really analogous, but when one party in our country wins the election, our people, or when somebody, maybe that's not a good analogy, but if somebody dies on the other side, it's like, oh, thank goodness, right? Yeah. So David's reaction is one of mourning. Like he is genuinely sad, and this is the guy who has terrorized him, been his enemy. But yet David recognized that he's still my king, right? And he's fallen. Okay, verse 13. And David said to the young man who told him, "Where do you come from?" And he answered, "I am the son of a sojourner, an Amalekite." Again, he's an Amalekite. David said to him, "How is it that you are not afraid to put forth your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Then David called one of the young men and said, "Go, fall upon him." And he struck him so that he died. And David said to him, "Your blood be upon your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have slain the Lord's anointed." So this guy comes thinking that, hey, not only have I found, I'm going to curry some favor with the most likely next king. But David's reaction surprises him. He's mourning Saul's death. And then when he pushes him on it further, right, he's like, "How dare you strike against the Lord's anointed?" Which is an expression meaning the king, right? The king is anointed. David's saying yeah, he wasn't a great king. He probably would have said that, right? But God still chose him, and my loyalty is still owed to him. David also here practices love of enemies, right? He doesn't let Saul get away with, he doesn't just, say, Saul defeat me. I mean, he's had to flee, right? But he has put into practice love of enemies. And so he says to this Amalekite, he says, "How dare you think that you have the authority to kill the one that God has chosen," right? David, by the way, another thing in 1 Samuel that we didn't read, David had multiple opportunities where he could have killed Saul, and he would have had good reasons. Right? Saul was trying to kill him, but he didn't do it. So he's not going to let this Amalekite get away with that kind of treachery, right? The bottom line is, the Amalekite has no respect for the office or for God. So the punishment for him is death, which again, on a spiritual level, remember, David is doing what Saul wouldn't do, which is wipe out the Amalekites. That's part of what's going on here. Okay. This expression that David says to him, "Blood be on your head," is an idiom, meaning that someone's guilty of bloodshed. You're guilty, essentially, right? David, is acting as a judge, which is part of his job too. So, all right. So yeah, doesn't end well. By the way, this kind of theme, this is a motif in the 1st and 2nd Samuel, where a messenger will come to report a death. And we'll see that later on. Okay, I won't tell you when, but yeah, so keep that in mind. All right, so next section, David's lamentation. And David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and Jonathan his son. And he said that it should be taught to the people of Judah. "Behold, it is written in the book of Jashar." Excuse me. Before I read it, anybody, what would you say? What would you define a lamentation as? Not quite. An allergy? Elegy. Yeah, elegy. Yeah, elegy would be allergy. Yeah. Uh-oh. Yeah, elegy. Yes, yeah, it would be more like a eulogy is speaking well of the dead, right? A lamentation is not that. Yeah, the definition that I found is it's a passionate song or poem of grief and sorrow. And so there's actually a book in the Bible called Lamentations. Did you know that? It was written by Jeremiah. If you want some depressing reading, read Lamentations. It is depressing. Um, and Lamentations are actually a fairly common genre in the Old Testament. A number of the Psalms are lamentations. Why? Because is sorrow and grief a very powerful and all too common emotion that we experience in this life? Absolutely, right? And the Bible is no stranger to that, and the people of the Old Testament are no stranger to that. And so God, through his scripture, through his word, gives us ways to grieve, essentially, right? The whole book is called Lamentations, and yeah, it is pretty depressing. But what is Jeremiah lamenting? The destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, a horrible, horrible event, right? That would have been, unimaginable. And so, yeah, so that's what a lament is. What's the lesson for us? Well, because lamentations are a normal and healthy part of life, and a normal and healthy part of the spiritual life. If you never lament anything, you're probably doing something wrong in your spiritual life. Not probably, you are, okay? Because most first and foremost, now we need to lament the right things, okay? That's another important thing. And that's part of what the lamentations in scripture teach us, is how to, not what to lament, and also how to lament. Because, lamenting that, like, I didn't get the mansion that I've always thought God should have given me, right? Like, that's not something to lament, right? Okay. But like, real things that are worth lamenting are important to lament. So things like death, it's okay. And our society, I think, does a terrible job of this. We do not do a good job of mourning or grieving, right? We just kind of want to sanitize all that. So that's part of it. But also, what's the biggest thing to lament? Our sins, right? To have lamentation over our sins and over the sins of the world, right? This valley of tears. It's not that we're depressed for the sake of being depressed. It's that, like, no, things that are lamentable should be grieved over. What does Jesus say? Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. In other words, we do need to mourn over things that are worth mourning. We shouldn't pretend, like a lot of our world does today, that, like, oh, everything's just fine, it's fine, and everything's happy, and I'll just ignore all the problems of my life and your life and pretend like they're not there. No, like there are things in this life that we need to lament. We're sojourners in this valley of tears. So lamentation is therefore an appropriate response at different times, and not always, okay? But yeah, and then what's the book of Jashar? There's a number of books in the Old Testament that are referenced that unfortunately just don't exist anymore. We don't have them anymore. So this was a book that was a collection of epic Hebrew poetry commemorating significant events in Israel's history. So it's a lost book, and we assume that David's lamentation here was recorded in the book of Jashar. There's also a section in Joshua chapter 10 that is a excerpt from the book of Jashar. So just like then, now they had different books, and unfortunately some of them just didn't survive. But that's what that is. Okay, so let's get into the actual lament. So verse 19, David said, "Your glory, O Israel, is slain upon your high places. How are the mighty fallen? Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. You mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, no upsurging of the deep. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul, not anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely. In life and in death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. You daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you daintily in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold upon your apparel. How are the mighty fallen in the midst of the battle? Jonathan lies slain upon your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How are the mighty fallen, and the weapons of war perished? Okay, wouldn't that be a nice thing if somebody would sing about you at your funeral if you fell in battle, right? Especially if you were their sworn enemy. Like, anyway, the main refrain, as you could see in this, is how are the mighty fallen? It's like, again, David is, like, he's my king. He's the anointed of God. And he recognizes, like, this is a tragedy for our country that, again, not that this is totally works, but like to translate in our own times, I would hope that, like, if someone assassinated the president, whoever it is, right, that like everybody in the country would be like, this is a tragedy for our country, right? Like, it's not a good thing, even if I didn't like the president at the time, right? Similar kind of idea. It doesn't quite work in the same way, but I would say even more so. It's even more meaningful back then. Like, your king is your leader, period, right? He's not elected. He's chosen by God, right? So let's just go through it a little more detailed. So verse 19, your glory, O Israel, your glory is Saul. He's referring to Saul, right, as the glory of Israel. He's the king. Gath and Ashkelon are important Philistine cities. So there's Gath, okay, and Ashkelon right there. Okay, so when he says, tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, like, we don't want the Philistines to know about this news because they're going to exalt over it, right? And then that's what he goes into, right? He says, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exalt. Uncircumcised, right, is shorthand for Gentiles, okay, non-Israelites. It's also ironic. There's an ironic twist here, because what was one of the things that started the rivalry between Saul and David? When the daughters of Israel started singing the song, David has slayed his 10,000s and Saul has slayed his thousands. And Saul gets jealous of David, right? Again, some things never change, right? Men competing for the praise and affection of women, right? Well, here we have an ironic reversal, right? David is saying, I hope this news doesn't, in a poetic way, right? Like, don't tell of this news in Philistia, because we don't want their women to be singing praises, right, about how Saul has fallen, right? So again, there's kind of a ironic reversal there. Let's see. You mountains of Gilboa, okay, where the battle took. Let there be no dew or rain upon you, no upsurging of the deep. Part of this is there was a kind of belief at the time among ancient peoples that a hero's death could trigger drought and famine. And sometimes, that's literally true, right? I mean, if we have chaos in our land, like if our king dies, we're on shaky ground, right? We might enter into a famine. So there's something to it. It's not just superstition. So he's saying, the land where he fell, like, is now like fallow land, essentially, right? Let's see where another way to say that is place of the Philistines' triumph should be barren ground. And then if we go to later in verse 21, it says that his shield was not anointed with oil. Shields at this time, they would be covered with leather, right, to help preserve them, and then the leather would be lathered in oil so that it was slick, and also so that it could preserve the shield better. So Saul's shield no longer has oil on it. Also, though, right, it's another reference to Saul himself is God's anointed. Okay, so that's what he's saying there. Again, this is like, this is the problem when you explain a poem, right? It's like, well, in some ways, poems are just meant to like be there, right? You're not supposed to like explain them away, but but that's what these are the references that he's making. Okay, and then in 22 through 25, he eulogizes Saul and Jonathan. So this would be he's talking about their good qualities. It is interesting that in death, for the most part, I mean, you can have some nasty funerals, right? But for the most part, we tend to only remember the good qualities of people when they die, or at the very least, we don't say bad things about them. We might think them, but we don't talk about it, right? There seems to be something like really wrong about that, right? like they're dead. It's over. Like there's just something. Even if they weren't the best person in the world, right? If they had some nasty qualities, we don't like. Man, she was just a gossip, right? Or like he had a short temper, and we just don't say that, right? We tend to. I think there is something kind of natural about like, let's just talk about the good things, right? And that's what David is doing here. Um, and then this last verse, I'm very distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. This is another story that we missed in First Samuel. Okay, this is David. First of all, David and Jonathan were brothers-in-law. David was married to Jonathan's sister Michal. Okay, we'll talk about her later. Um, so they were actually related through marriage. They also had made a covenant with each other in 1 Samuel 18. They had a blood bond, a friendship, right? And Jonathan, who could have been a contender for the throne, his father was the king. He recognized, no, David, God has chosen you. You're the guy. And he also saw the injustice of his father Saul and how David was just. And so he sided with David. So there's a story where Jonathan helps David escape from his father, and Saul's not very happy about this. Jonathan could have been jealous of David, but instead they're a model of true friendship. They will each other's good, right? To love is to will the good of the other, and David and Jonathan, are a great example of that. Probably two of, if not the most famous friends in the Bible. They could have very easily been natural rivals, but they weren't. Okay, now this one line that kind of bothers us a little bit, or it sounds strange to us today. Okay, he says, of Jonathan, your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. Okay, in no way does this verse imply homosexual love. Okay, depending on some modern interpreters who have an axe to grind, this is one of their favorite passages, but we won't go there. First of all, there's a couple of things to understand here. Ancient peoples often considered philia, friendship love, as higher than eros, romantic love, because they saw it as purer, right? More based on your choice. Whereas with eros, it's kind of like, I can't help it, right? And it's like, oh, it's a bout of passion, right? Whereas friendship is more dispassionate in a good way, like in the sense of like I choose friends. So in the mind of a lot of ancient peoples, we would tend to, I think today, for various reasons, we valorize romantic love. And I'm not saying this to denigrate it. I'm just saying that, back then it would have been the other way around. They would have seen friendship love as a higher love than eros, and there would have been nothing sexual about that, about friendship love. Unfortunately, this is a little bit of an aside, but like unfortunately, I think one of the tragedies of the like homosexual culture that has been built up over the last few decades is an erosion of like friendship love, because it's kind of like, oh, it's got to be sexual at some point. No, it doesn't actually, right? Anyway, that's a little bit of an aside, but that was not a thing back then, right? They weren't. That was not a thing. Also, Aristotle, for example, who was a little bit after this time and different culture, but he taught that men could only be true friends with other men, because he taught that friendship could only be between peers or equals, right? You can't really be, and again, there's a little bit of that even today, right? Like it's not that men and women can't be friends, but it's just like you're friends with. But even if it's not men and women, right? Like if you're have two people who are very different places in society, they can't really be friends, right? There's too much of a power dynamic there, right? So there's something to what Aristotle was saying there. The other thing too is that we probably underestimate, but I mean, we still have this too today, but especially in this time, there would have been a very, very strong brotherly bond between warriors. They spend a lot of time on the road in camp. I mean, again, you have this today in the military a little bit, but I mean, even more so then, right? It's like David has been roaming around, and he trusts his guys, and he spent a lot of time with them, right? And so there's a bond of trust and friendship there, right? But in no way does that imply homoeroticism either, right? It's like, no, we're defending our country or whatever, okay? And I think the last thing is David's whole point of saying that your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. His whole point is that his friendship with Jonathan was greater than his relationships with his lovers, right? That's the whole point. It's that he's not saying like, I liked my lover activity with you more. No, he's saying, no, our friendship was so great that it was greater than that romantic love, right? That's his whole point. Anyway, so I won't. Um, Oh, yeah. Well, it's important to say this. This lamentation needs to be read in context, right? A lamentation is a very passionate and emotional outburst of grief, right? It's like he's obviously he's exaggerating and having poetic license, right? So, he's saying, yeah, my love for you is stronger than that of past that of women. And then, like I said, last but not least, homosexual acts are strongly condemned in the Mosaic Law. So it'd be kind of strange for the sacred authors to put this in there. Like I said, there are people today who have an axe to grind. They will look at this passage, try to tell you something different, but it's not there, right? So anyway, all right, and moving on, chapter 2. After this, David inquired of the Lord, shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah? And the Lord said to him, go up. David said, to which shall I go? And he said, to Hebron. So I think, well, here, let me read these next two verses. So David went up there, and his two wives also, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. I think these were the two wives who got abducted by the Amalekites. And David brought up his men who were with him, every one with his household, and they dwelt in the towns of Hebron. And the men of Judah came, and they anointed David king over the house of Judah. So Hebron is right here, okay? So it's deep in the heart of Judah, okay? And now that Saul's gone, right, it naturally, David has been the leader of the tribe of Judah for a while now. Naturally, now that there's a power vacuum, he's their king, okay? So Hebron was a leading city of Judah at the time, 20 miles south of Jerusalem. The first thing to notice, though, is notice that David, right, even for this seemingly pretty easy and natural move, prays about it, right? He asks God for guidance. That's a feature that we see David very often, right? And that's in contrast to Saul, who was kind of wishy-washy, whether or not he really would. But David, every step of the way, he's praying. He's asking God, is this what you want me to do next, right? Okay, and we'll see that multiple times. So Hebron, okay, is about 20 miles south of Jerusalem, so about 20 miles between here and there, right? Deep in the heart of Judah, okay, leading town at the time. And we'll see this later, I'll spell it out, but Hebron becomes David's capital for over 7 years. Hebron also has very strong associations with Abraham. It was when Abraham was at Hebron that God promised the land to Abraham's descendants. Okay, so that's significant. And then also, Abraham bought a cave in Hebron from some locals at the time. And Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Leah were all buried in Hebron, in what's called the Cave of the Patriarchs. And even to this day, in this area, in Hebron, is the Cave of the Patriarchs, where those people were buried. Okay. Rachel was not buried there because she died in childbirth, so she was in a different location. Okay. Anyway, so this is a significant location, not just for the tribe of Judah, but for the people. So then David is anointed as king of the house of Judah. What would be a title at this point that David has? King of the Jews. Where have you seen that before? That was the title that was given to Jesus by Pilate when he died, right? INRI. Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judeorum. Rex Judeorum is Latin for King of the Jews. That's the RI. Okay. So David is the first King of the Jews. King of the King of the tribe of Judah. Okay. Now what we're going to see, okay, is that David, as King of the Jews, becomes the King of Israel, right? Judah is the royal. So, that the king of the other tribes have their leaders, have their kings, so to speak. But this title is not just we'll see here. It doesn't become just the King of the Jews. It's the King of United Israel, right? So this title obviously takes on some significance, but here we have for the first time someone can rightly be called the King of the Jews. Okay. All right. When they told, continuing with verse 4, when they told David, it was the men of Jabesh Gilead who buried Saul. David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh Gilead and said to them, may you be blessed by the Lord, because you showed this loyalty to Saul your Lord and buried him. Now may the Lord show mercy and faithfulness to you, and I will do good to you because you have done this thing. Now therefore let your hands be strong and be valiant, for Saul your Lord is dead, and the house of Judah has anointed me king over them. So Jabesh Gilead, I think it's on this map, maybe not. Ooh, I thought it was. Jabesh Gilead is up here, though. It's in the tribe of Manasseh. Okay. Now, one thing that's kind of a detail that's not told here, I should probably mention this. I don't think I've mentioned this yet. Did you know that there's another place in the Bible where this story is also told? Another book. You know what book that is? No. Kings is, yeah, good guess. So Kings is a continuation of this story. 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. It's the book of Chronicles. Okay. Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Chronicles is probably underrated because we focus a lot on Samuel and Kings. Chronicles was written by someone after the exile, okay, looking back on these stories, and he would have used 2nd Samuel as a source text, but he had other sources that we don't have access to anymore. And Chronicles is kind of a retelling the story, but with a particular focus for the post-exilic Jews, the Jews who had been exiled and were returning to rebuild Jerusalem. And the chronicler, as he's called, is retelling the story, not telling a new story, but he's filling in details that were not there in some of these texts, okay? And he's also has certain points he wants to emphasize. He wants to emphasize kind of the history of David and the temple and how it led to the temple and the liturgy of their time. Okay, not to tell a new story, but just telling the same story with a particular lens looking back. Okay, and so there are sources in Chronicles, whereas 2 Samuel, more of the stories in 2 Samuel would have been written more shortly after the time, and 2 Samuel would have been source material for the chronicler. Okay. However, there are certain details that the chronicler has in Chronicles that are not in 2 Samuel. One of the details is, David's like, oh, great, Jabesh Gilead, great, what did they do? Well, actually, the Philistines, when they took Saul, the Chronicles says that when the Philistines took Saul's body, they took his body and his head and put it as a trophy in the pagan temple to the idol Dagon, who was a Philistine idol god, right? Well, the men of Jabesh Gilead from the tribe of Manasseh, I believe, they went down and they went to this temple, raided it, took the body of Saul, and gave him a proper burial, right? And so David is not, David is rewarding them for praising them for a heroic deed, okay, because they did do a heroic deed. Because again, first of all, having your king's body as an ornament in a pagan temple, right, is no good. But also leaving the body unburied is an extreme disgrace in ancient times, and in ours too, I would say, right? So anyway, so David is praising their heroism. He's also, acting as a politician, right? Not in a bad way, but in a good way, right? He's just been proclaimed king of the Jews, king of Judah, okay? And he's trying to win favor with other cities so that they can recognize his leadership and his kingship, okay? So, and again, it's both. It's not, it doesn't mean it has to be just genuine, okay? And he's already kind of exercising a kingly-like role. All right, okay, let's keep going, verse 8. Now Abner, the son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim, and made him king over Gilead, and the Ashurites, and Jezreel, and Ephraim, and Benjamin, and all Israel. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. But the house of Judah followed David. And the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. Okay, so this figure, Ishbosheth, okay, he's made king of Israel. He's a son of Saul, and with the help of Abner, Saul's chief in command, he becomes essentially king of the northern tribes. Okay. However, well, and I wrote here, what's happening here is a kind of Game of Thrones. Okay. But that's true, right? It's like we have this kind of it does end up kind of basically being a civil war, but it's a race for the throne. Who is going to be the who's going to consolidate power to be the king of United Israel? Abner, as I said, was Saul's cousin, and he was his chief military officer. And then Ishbosheth was Saul's only surviving sons. Remember, Jonathan and the others had been killed. And we will see that Ishbosheth, really weak king. Probably was not the son of Saul, who expected to be king, and he ends up being a very weak figure. Abner is really the power behind Ishbosheth. Okay, we'll see that play out here. And we've already been told that part of Saul's punishment from God is that he will not be given a family dynasty, right? So, God has not chosen Ishbosheth. Okay, Mahanaim, okay, is east of the Jordan. So Ishbosheth, Abner sets him up here. Okay, that's Mahanaim. Okay, it's east of the Jordan, so it is well far away from the Philistines, right? Okay, it's safer there, and that becomes Ishbosheth's kind of capital, so to speak. All right, and again, he's made king over the northern tribes for essentially 2 years. This is also, and this is part of where again, these stories were written shortly after the events, but also there are people looking back on these events who seem to have knowledge of the divided kingdom. There's also kind of a preview here of the divided kingdom. David's grandson, the 10 tribes in the north will rebel against the 2 tribes in the south. Okay. Anyway, there's kind of a foreshadowing there that's possible that we have a divided kingdom in this interim period. Okay. The Battle of Gibeon. So verse 12, Abner, the son of Ner, and the servants of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon. And Joab, the son of Zeruiah, and the servants of David went out and met them at the pool of Gibeon. And they sat down, the one on one side of the pool and the other on the other side of the pool. So Gibeon, it's right here. Gibeon is this town in Benjamin. Okay, so Abner and Ishbosheth are coming from here. Joab is coming up from Hebron. Who's Joab? He's going to be an important figure. Okay, he is David's nephew, and he eventually becomes David's chief in command. Okay, he's the son of David's sister. That her name Zeruiah. Okay, so Gibeon is pretty close to Jerusalem, and there is archaeologists. Actually, I didn't know this until I was doing the research for this. Archaeologists have actually found a giant water reservoir at Gibeon, which is what's referred to here as the pool of Gibeon. So we're in the midst of this kind of 2-year interim period where, we're kind of, jockeying for the throne, and we got a force of Ishbosheth and a force of Joab representing David, and they're going to have a little bit of a throwdown. Okay. 14. And Abner said to Joab, "Yet the young men arise and play before us." And Joab said, "Let them arise." So play before us, some kind of combat entertainment. Okay. Let's just keep reading. Then they arose and passed over by number, 12 for Benjamin and Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and 12 of the servants of David. So the idea is we'll have this 12 on 12 combat. We'll settle the dispute without having need for a whole battle. Same kind of idea of David and Goliath, right? Instead of having tons of bloodshed, we'll just have a representative from each of our groups. We'll see who fights it out and wins, and then we'll call it good, okay? This is also symbolic, though. It's 12 on 12. It's also symbolic of the division of Israel, right? That we're in a divided Israel right now. What happens, though, verse 16, and each caught his opponent by the head and thrust his sword in his opponent's side, so they fell down together. Therefore, that place was called Hel Kath Hazarim, which is at Gibeon. And the battle was very fierce that day, and Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. So they have this 12 on 12 battle. turns out nobody wins. They all fall in the story, right? And then they end up having the battle anyway. So much for the combat entertainment to decide this dispute, right? And it says that David's men eventually win. So we're in a civil war here. And this was some event that took place within this 2-year period where we got David as king of Judah and Ishbosheth is put up as king in the north, okay? So then we keep going, verse 18. And the 3 sons of Zeruiah were there, David's sister, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. So David's sister, so these are his 3 nephews. Now Asahel was as swift of foot as a wild gazelle, and Asahel pursued Abner. And as he went, he turned neither to the right hand nor to the left from following Abner. Then Abner looked behind him and said, "Is it you, Asahel?" And he answered, "It is I." Abner said to him, "Turn aside to your right hand or to your left, and seize one of the young men, and take his spoil." Like, he's thinking, what are you after me for, right? Take some spoil, some booty from one of these guys who's fallen, okay? But Asahel would not turn aside from following him. And Abner said again to Asahel, "Turn aside from following me. Why should I strike you to the ground? How then could I lift up my face to your brother Joab?" But he refused to turn aside. Therefore Abner struck him in the belly with the butt of his spear, so that the spear came out at his back, and he fell there and died where he was. And all who came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died stood still. By the way, David is in his late 20s, we'll find, because he's actually about 30 years old. Okay, we'll talk about that later. So his nephews are probably teenagers, right? Because again, like in this time, as soon as you're a teenager, like time to earn your stripes, right? Start fighting. So these are probably teenagers. Well, Asahel, right, who's very swift of foot, he's pursuing the veteran, grizzled general Abner, who knows how to win wars and stuff like that. And he's able to keep pursuing him because he's young and fleet of foot. And Abner keeps warning him, like, "Hey, this isn't going to end well, like, because you can't beat me, right? But he's a little over aggressive, okay? Asahel, right? And so eventually Abner's offering this truce, but Asahel refuses. So eventually Abner's like, "Okay, I warned you twice," and runs him through, right? Okay. We're going to see, okay, that David's nephews, Joab, Asahel, and Abishai, they are kind of hotheads, right? They're good soldiers, but they're a little rash. And we'll see that. That's kind of another theme that will kind of play along, okay? So anyway, so that's how, that there goes Asahel. Probably a teenager. He picked a fight with someone who wasn't his size, right? Someone who was much more experienced than him. He gets run through, okay? 24, but Joab and Abishai pursued Abner. And as the sun was going down, they came to the hill of Ammah, which lies before Giah on the way to the wilderness of Gibeon. And the Benjaminites gathered themselves together behind Abner, because remember the location, we're in the tribe of Benjamin right now, in the tribal land of Benjamin, okay? Gathered together behind Abner and became one band and took their stand on top of the hill. Then Abner called to Joab, "Shall the sword devour forever? Do you not know that the end will be bitter? How long will it be before you bid your people turn from the pursuit of their brethren?" And Joab said, "As God lives, if you had not spoken, surely the men would have given up the pursuit of their brethren in the morning." So Joab blew the trumpet, and all the men stopped and pursued Israel no more, nor did they fight any longer. So basically, Joab and what's the other brother, Abishai, they're pursuing Abner, right, to get revenge for their brother. But the Benjaminites rally behind Abner, and eventually they say, "Okay, fine, ceasefire, truce for now," right? Okay, for now. And Abner, verse 29, and Abner and his men went all that night through the Arabah, and they crossed the Jordan, and marching the whole forenoon, they came to Mahanaim. So back to the kind of de facto capital of Ishbosheth. Joab returned from the pursuit of Abner, and when he had gathered all the people together, there were missing of David's servants 19 men besides Asahel. But the servants of David had slain of Benjamin 360 of Abner's men. So Joab representing David, loses 20 men. Abner, representing Ishbosheth, loses 360. Okay, so David clearly wins. Okay, but the servants, and they took up Asahel and buried him in the tomb of his father, which was at Bethlehem. And Joab and his men marched all night, and the day broke upon them at Hebron. So this whole chapter, second half of this chapter, right, is this little battle that happened in this 2-year period as kind of representative of the kind of things that are going on, right? And it's going to play into the story a little bit here in a bit. Okay, all right, chapter 3. There was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, and David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker. So we got a little glimpse of that, right? But David's going up, house of Saul, Ishbosheth, going down, right? Okay. Verse 2. And sons were born to David at Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon of I'll try my best on these Hebrew names. Ahinoam of Jezreel, and his son Chileab of Abigail, the widow of Nabal at Carmel, and the third Absalom, the son of Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur, and the fourth Adonijah, the son of Haggith, and the fifth Shephatiah, the son of Abital, and the sixth Ithraim of Eglah, David's wife. These were born to David at Hebron. So in Hebron, while David's in Hebron, he ends up being here for 7 years, okay? He has 6 sons by 6 wives. Again, this was a common practice of ancient Near East kings of the time. A lot of these marriages would have been political marriages. Notice, why it's noted where the wife is from. David, one of the ways you consolidated power was you forged marriages with your neighbors so that they were less likely to attack you, right? For example, I have an example there. Geshur was a small kingdom east of the Sea of Galilee, so it would have been up here. Okay. So yeah, David is starting to form alliances through these political marriages. Okay. It's interesting though, because Deuteronomy expressly forbids an Israelite king from multiplying wives. Okay. But really, the author is just reporting the facts, right? We're not morally evaluating polygamy here, but at the time, it was a way that you consolidated power, right? Because if you have more children, you're going to have more. Well, you're going to have more sons to be in your army, right? And generals, right, who are loyal to you, hopefully, and then more daughters to form your own political marriages, right? That's and that wasn't just in ancient Near East, right? That was a pretty long time into even European history, right? I don't know. I guess some places today maybe too, but not as common today. So it's about shrewd political maneuvering, right? And also in this time, even if Deuteronomy, and certainly it was not God's original plan, even if God was allowing polygamy, right? It's also they would have taken it at the time as a sign of blessings and abundance, right? God is blessing David with children, right? And so that's just the way it was, right? Okay, so let's keep going. Verse 6, while there was a war between the house of Saul and the house of David, Abner was making himself strong in the house of Saul. Now Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, and Ishbosheth said to Abner, why have you gone in to my father's concubine? Then Abner was very angry over the words of Ishbosheth and said, am I a dog's head of Judah? This day I keep showing loyalty to the house of Saul, your father, to his brothers and to his friends, and have not given you into the hand of David. And yet you charge me today with a fault concerning a woman? God do so to Abner and more also, if I do not accomplish for David what the Lord has sworn to him, to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and set up the throne of David over Israel and over Judah from Dan to Beersheba. And Ishbosheth could not answer Abner another word because he feared him. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, again, in this Game of Thrones, okay, Abner takes one of Saul's concubines as his own, and it's a power play move, right? Because it's and Ishbosheth, who's a weak king, totally reliant on Abner. Abner's the real power here, okay? Ishbosheth, that does not go unnoticed, right? Hey, you just took one of my father's concubines. What are you trying to do here, right? And Abner's basically tough, right? What are you going to do to me, right? He knows who's really the power here, okay? And so again, this is all about political power plays. Okay. So Abner rebukes him, puts him in his place. This expression, Dan to Beersheba, it's an expression that you see throughout the Bible, and it represents basically all the land of Israel. Dan in the north, that's Dan up there, to Beersheba in the south. So it's just an expression that just means the whole land of Israel, north to south, directionally. Okay, Dan to Beersheba. So basically, Abner, right? He's like, dude, you're weak. You're weak sauce, and like, I'm gonna go to David. Basically, is what he tells him. Like I can't deal with you anymore. The old adage, right? If you can't beat him, join him. So Abner knows knows where it's headed. Okay. Um, Verse 12, and Abner sent messengers to David at Hebron, saying, to whom does the land belong? Make your covenant with me, and behold, my hand shall be with you to bring over all Israel to you. And he said, good, I will make a covenant with you. But one thing I require of you, that is, you shall not see my face unless you first bring Michal, Saul's daughter, when you come to see my face. Then David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, saying, give me my wife Michal, whom I betrothed at the price of 100 foreskins of the Philistines. And Ishbosheth sent and took her from her husband Paltiel, the son of Laish. But her husband went with her, weeping after her all the way to Bahurim. Then Abner said to him, go return, and he returned. What's going on here? Well, again, another story that I did mention it last week. David Mary is betrothed to Michal at the price, and the bride price is 100 Philistine foreskins. David brings back 200, okay? Because if you get that close and get a man's foreskin, you killed him, right? And then he's married to Michal. Well, later when David, and Michal, she is in love with David. She loves David. She sees her father's injustice towards him. She even helps David escape. Later, when David is wandering around fleeing from Saul, Saul, as a way to stick it to David, gives Michal to this guy Paltiel, to another man, right, to stick it to David. So David, a couple things here, okay? He's testing Abner's loyalty, right? Like, hey, by the way, my wife that Saul, gave to another man, bring her back to me, right? Because to test his loyalty, okay? Also, Michal is Saul's daughter, so making sure that she's in David's house only increases his claim to the throne, right? So there's another power play, okay? And then also, it is his wife, right? I mean, she was, whether through no fault of her own, right, or whatever, was living in adultery. However, okay, it seems, based on this kind of pathetic character of Paltiel, who's weeping after her, like, oh, don't take her, right? It does seem like in the meantime, for whatever reason, she, at least he, really cares about her, right? And we don't really see that with David. Okay, that's going to come up later. Unfortunately, spoiler alert, like Michal and David's relationship starts out really blissful and wonderful, but it sours. And it's part of what might be going on here is David wants her back for political reasons, right? Now, does he have a right to do it? Yeah, absolutely, right? But it does seem like her and Paltiel had a real bond of affection because he's weeping, and Abner says, sorry, man, tough, like you go back to your home, right? And he's crying after her, right? St. Augustine does draw a parallel between David taking back his wife to Christ's compassion for the woman caught in adultery. Now, again, and this will come up later too, we don't really know Michal's perspective, okay? The bottom line is the story is just not told from her perspective. They don't do, in the Bible, they don't do the kind of character development that we're used to where every character is developed. This story is told, it's primarily about God, right? And God's relationship to his people. And it's primarily told from the perspective of David. We just don't know, right? Whether or not she was, now, but again, on the surface, right? She is living in adultery, right? Like whether or not that was her fault. And so David has every right. So St. Augustine says that, David was having compassion on her. But it seems, based on what happens later, that, she wasn't too happy about this, right? Because in the meantime, what's been happening, right? David has more wives, more concubines, more power. It's not so exclusive with him anymore, right? So anyway, we don't, but the bottom line, and again, like different, different modern commentators, depending on who you read. I mean, I don't read these people, but like they'll kind of have an axe to grind, and they'll try to like paint her as a sympathetic figure. We really just don't know, right? It's not that she was or wasn't. It's just we just know from David's perspective, and he was taking her back. So, okay, all right. Verse 17, and Abner conferred with the elders of Israel, saying, for some time past you have been seeking David as king over you. Now then bring it about, for the Lord has promised David, saying, by the hand of my servant David I will save my people Israel from the hands of the Philistines and from the hands of all their enemies. Abner also spoke to Benjamin, and then Abner went to tell David at Hebron that all Israel and the whole house of Benjamin thought good to do. When Abner came with 20 men to David at Hebron, David made a feast for Abner and the men who were with him. And Abner said to David, I will arise and go, and will gather all Israel to my lord and king, the king, that they may make a covenant with you, so that you may reign over all that your heart desires. So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace. So Abner lobbies for the northern tribes to join David, and David is obviously gaining in popularity. He even enjoyed popularity during Saul's time, right? The whole thing of David has slain his 10,000s and Saul his thousands, right? So it's not like, and he hasn't done anything to oppress these northern tribes. But as Ishbosheth is getting weaker and David's getting stronger, it's like, yeah, David's the guy. And Abner is the mediator to make that happen. And he does that. Obviously, Abner, right? Trying to curry favor with the new king, right? David and Abner are at peace now. And part of why this is emphasized in this text is to exonerate David from what's about to happen, okay? And a meal, sharing a meal together, is a symbol of unity, fellowship, and peace throughout the Old Testament, throughout the Bible, right? Sharing a meal. There's a lot that could be said there. Okay. But it's emphasized that David and Abner were cool, right? Because what happens next, right? 22. Just then the servants of David arrived with Joab from a raid, bringing much spoil with them. But Abner was not with David at Hebron, for he had sent him away, and he had gone in peace. When Joab and all the army that was with him came, it was told Joab, Abner the son of Ner came to the king, and he let him go, and he has gone in peace. Then Joab went to the king and said, what have you done? No, remember, this is his uncle. Behold, Abner came to you. Why is it that you have sent him away, so that he is gone? You know that Abner, son of Ner, came to deceive you, and to know you're going out and you're coming in, and to know all that you are doing. So Joab is like, I don't trust this guy, and you shouldn't either. Now, obviously, we know, and David knows too, right, that, he killed Asahel, right? So when Joab came out of from David's presence, he sent messengers after Abner, and they brought him back from the cistern of Sirah, but David did not know about it. Again, David didn't know, okay? And when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside into the midst of the gate to speak with him privately, and there he struck him in the belly, so that he died, for the blood of Asahel his brother. Afterward, when David heard of it, he said, I and my kingdom are forever guiltless before the Lord for the blood of Abner, the son of Ner. May it fall upon the head of Joab and upon all his father's house, and may the house of Joab never be without one who has a discharge, or who is leprous, or who holds a spindle, or who is slain by the sword, or who lacks bread. So Joab and Abishai, his brother, slew Abner because he had killed their brother Asahel in the battle of Gibeon. So pretty treacherous, right? He calls back Abner under false pretenses, and he runs him through. Notice it's an eye for an eye kind of justice. The same way that Abner killed Asahel, it's the same way that Joab kills Abner. Okay, and David, obviously, as we just saw, David places all the blame and the guilt on Joab since he didn't know. And he also seems to, from those verses and the verses that follow, to have genuine remorse for Abner's death. Now, also, it's a both and, right? I mean, it doesn't look good if David is committing this kind of treachery. But based on the text and based on the reaction of the people of Israel, they seem to think David was genuinely innocent of this, that it was a vendetta that Joab had against him. So So David gives another lament for Abner. It's not as big or as profound as lament over Saul and Joshua, but again, notice, David, and we'll talk more about this as we go on, but David is a poet and a songwriter, and he composes this song for Abner, right? Then David said to Joab and to all the peoples who were with him, tear your clothes and put on sackcloth and mourn before Abner. And King David followed the bier. I don't know how you say that word. They buried Abner at Hebron, and the king lifted up his voice and wept at the grave of Abner, and all the people wept. And the king lamented for Abner, saying, and here's the lament, should Abner die as a fool dies? Your hands were not bound, your feet were not fettered. As one falls before the wicked, you have fallen. And all the people wept over him again, wept again over him. Then all the people came to persuade David to eat bread while it was yet day. But David swore, saying, God do so to me and more also, if I taste bread or anything else till the sun goes down. So he makes a vow that he's going to fast for Abner, right? Again, he's not just saying it, he's showing with his actions that he is remorseful. And all the people took notice of it, and it pleased them, as everything that the king did pleased all the people. So all the people and all Israel understood that day that it had not been the king's will to slay Abner the son of Ner. And the king said to his servants, do you not know that a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel? And I am this day weak, though anointed king. These men, the sons of Zeruiah, are too hard for me. The Lord repay the evildoer according to his wickedness. So, he publicly rebukes his nephew. And Joab will eventually get what's coming to him, but it's not going to happen in 2 Samuel. You have to go to Kings for that. Okay. And people buy it, right? And again, like, you could be more cynical and say, well, it was just a show. Yeah, but I think you take the text at face value. It's like, yeah, David didn't know any better, didn't know about this, and he showed that he was remorseful, and the people saw that, and they were like, yeah, great, okay. All right, so now Abner's out of the way. Okay, not because this is important, right? Because part of what the author of Samuel is doing is showing us that, like, the transition from the house of Saul to the house of David was legitimate, right? It was not because of treachery on David's part. But it is still true, right? That, like, Abner is now not a threat. Not that he was necessarily going to be, but whether he was the strong man of the north. He was right. So now we get to chapter 4. This is a pretty short chapter. Ishbosheth is assassinated. When Ishbosheth, Saul's son, heard that Abner had died at Hebron, his courage failed, and all Israel was dismayed. If your king's courage fails, that's not good, right? So, his courage fails because he knows his chief military guy, the guy who's really the power, is gone, right? Now Saul's sons had 2 men who were captains of raiding bands. The name of one was Baana, and the name of the other Rechab, the sons of Rimmon, a man of Benjamin. Benjamin, remember, is the tribe of Saul, okay? From Beeroth, for Beeroth is also reckoned to Benjamin. The Beerothites fled to Gittaim, and have been sojourners there to this day. Jonathan, the son of Saul, had a son who was crippled in his feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. And his nurse took him up and fled. And as she fled in her haste, he fell and became lame. And his name was Mephibosheth. This is a little bit of an aside, okay? Why is it an aside? Because Mephibosheth is going to come up later. David is, well, we'll see. David, has a chance to do what he wants with him, but he ends up taking him in and taking care of him because of his father, Jonathan. So we have a little bit of a side, and we also get the story of why was he lame? Because they were fleeing from a battle, his nurse dropped him, and he was lame. That's a little bit of an aside. I'm not sure why exactly it's inserted here, other than just to let us know that, like, foreshadowing that, like, yeah, there are some descendants of Saul who don't end up dead, okay? Now the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, Rechab and Baana, set out, and about the heat of the day they came to the house of Ishbosheth, as he was taking his noonday rest. And behold, the doorkeeper of the house had been cleaning wheat, but she grew drowsy and slept. So Rechab and Baana, his brother, slipped in. When they came into the house, as he lay on his bed in his bedchamber, they struck him and slew him and beheaded him. They took his head and went by the way of Arabah all night, and brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron. And they said to the king, Here is the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life. The Lord has avenged my lord the king this day on Saul and his offspring. Does this sound kind of familiar? Like people assassinating someone who they think will help out David, and they bring the news to David. Okay, again, it's a motif. All right. As the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life out of every adverse. Oh wait. But David answered Rechab and Baanah his brother, the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite. As the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life out of every adversity, when one told me, Behold, Saul is dead, and I slew him at Ziklag, which was the reward I gave him for his news, how much more, when wicked men have slain a righteous man in his own house upon his bed, shall I not now require his blood at your hand and destroy you from the earth? And David commanded his young men, and they killed them, cut off their hands and feet, and hanged them beside the pool at Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the tomb of Abner at Hebron. So again, here's the motif, right? Is like these guys, these Benjaminites are saying, well, we know where this is headed. Let's kill David's rival, assassinate him. David will have favor with us. But David is a righteous king. Notice he hasn't done anything that's unjust. He hasn't done any treachery. He hasn't betrayed anybody, right? He's been faithful to, everything that he's done has been just, right? And so then he points out to these guys, he's like, you guys are wicked men who killed an innocent man in his own bed, right? That's bad. So they get an even worse punishment, right? They're not only, killed, but their hands and feet are cut off and they're hanged, right? And so again, it's like, David has known since he was a boy that he was God's anointed, that God had, right? But David never commits an evil to bring about that good, right? That's really kind of important here, right? That's part of what, and again, we're going through David's rise, right? Eventually we'll get to when he's actually reigning. But this whole time is partly to exonerate David that, his rise to the throne was legitimate. He didn't engage in treachery and barbarism, right? It was a legitimate and again, and this is kind of one of the meta themes of 2 Samuel is, remember, God using secondary causes, very human causes, to bring about his purposes, right? David does not take God's promises into his own hands and say, well, I'm supposed to be king, and then commit all these injustices, all these evils, right? Yet God works that you could explain a lot of this, again, Game of Thrones has nothing on this, right? Game of Thrones, in fact, was based on some of this stuff, but and there's even, there's TV shows about this, right? You could explain a lot of these things through very human, political, psychological causes, and that's all true. At the same time, though, and this is the kind of meta theme, is God is working his purposes through the decisions of fallen human beings. God's purposes are not thwarted, not because he wills evil things to happen, but it's not like God's like, oh, now what do I do, right? No, God is able to bring about his purposes in the very ordinary causes of human beings, right? That's how this is playing out. And that's how God often operates, right? There are times where God directly, so to speak, from our perspective, intervenes. But God is always directly intervening in ways that we don't necessarily see, except for in hindsight. And even then, we don't always see them, right? We can see, and the author of Samuel can see how, wow, God had, all these events kind of orchestrated themselves in a way to where David became the undisputed, legitimate king of Israel. But not because, but through causes that are very human, right? And could be explained, as we have been explaining them, in very human ways, right? Does that make sense? Kind of, and I think that's part of what's instructive for us too. As we're reading scripture, part of what we're supposed to learn is learning how to read our lives and even the events of world history this way, right? That God's purposes are not thwarted. Yet that also doesn't mean that we can take things into our own hands, right? Like God's will be done, and then I kill some innocent person, right? That's not, no, God doesn't ordain that. But does that mean that God's like, well, darn it, that ruins my plan, right? No, God is behind the scenes, right? Directing everything in a way that we can't comprehend. And he's always doing that. So part of the reason why we read these stories is so that we can hopefully read our own lives that way, okay? Maybe not this dramatic, but with all this death and violence, okay? But, again, it's a good story. All right. Okay. So so now Ishbosheth is out of the way, right? He's not a rival anymore, okay? Chapter 5. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "Behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you that led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel." So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and at Jerusalem he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, finally, Abner's gone, Ishbosheth is gone, David is the undisputed king of united Israel. Notice again, he does not win his united kingdom through conquest. They come to him, right? He is a magnet, okay? He gathers the tribes together, okay? What do they say to him? They say, "You're our bone and flesh," meaning you're our kinsman. There's also an echo here of the language that Adam uses to describe Eve, right? Bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. The coming together of the 12 tribes is a kind of marriage, right? It's more than just like a political alliance. It's like, yeah, we're family. We're flesh and bone, right? They recognize, and what are they doing here? The leaders of the tribes, they're recognizing David's leadership during the time of Saul. They recognize that he was anointed by Samuel, okay? And again, David doesn't do this by war and conquest. He doesn't do it the way of earthly kings. The tribes come to him. Same with who? Same with Jesus, right? Jesus did not come. He said, "I'm a king," right? "My kingdom's not of this world," though. And Jesus did not come in the way that many expected him in his time. He didn't come through military conquest, okay? Jesus does wage war, but it's not against the powers of this world. It's against the powers of the spiritual world. He wages war as a Davidic warrior, but against who? The demons, right? That's who he's really concerned about. He's not concerned about the Romans per se, right? Because his kingdom's not of this world. And Jesus doesn't win his kingdom through military war and conquest. And there's a line where he says, "When I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all men to myself," right? Jesus, the way that he wins his kingdom is the kind of magnetism of himself. And that's what David is doing here, right? Jesus gathers the tribes back, just like David. That's one of the themes in the gospel. As Jesus is traveling around this area, he's gathering back the tribes, bringing them back together to right relationship with God and with each other. That was something that the Messiah in Jesus' time was expected to do, because that's what David did. David gathered the tribes, right? Okay. And then we have 2 Samuel 5:2, this verse with this quote, "You shall be a shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel." This verse is notable because you remember Herod. He asks his chief priests and scribes where the Messiah is to be born. They actually cite this verse. They cite a verse from the book of Micah, "In Bethlehem of Ephratah," right? You aren't least among the tribes of Judah. And then they reference that will come a shepherd from Judah who will shepherd my people Israel, right? So this verse is referenced in the Christmas story by Herod's experts, okay? Why? Because the Messiah was interpreted as someone from the tribe of Judah who would unite all of Israel. Remember, King of the Jews means that you are also therefore King of Israel, is what it comes to mean, right? Just like how, the Bishop of Rome one of his, because he's the Bishop of Rome, he also gets the title Pope, right? Same kind of deal. The King of the Jews is the king of the rightful king of Israel. Okay. Does Jesus, come from the tribe of Judah and unite all of Israel? Yes, absolutely, but not in an unexpected way, right? Not through military conquest, but by giving up his life and rising from the dead. Then they make a covenant with him, with David. Okay. And he's anointed. This is actually the third time David's anointed. First, he's anointed by Samuel. Then he's anointed as king of Judah. Now he's anointed as king of Israel. Then it talks about his 4-year reign. He reigned from age 30 to age 70, which is from these dates, 1010 to 970 BC. Okay. Interesting. Few things here. First of all, how old was Jesus when he began his public ministry? He was about 30, right? So David has come of age, right, to reign as king. Now, granted, when he was 30 is when he was named King of the Jews, right? First, okay. So same age as Jesus when he started his public ministry, and then 7 and 40 are numbers of completeness and wholeness. So they're also symbolic. Numbers in this time are very symbolic, okay, because they mean certain things. And then his reign over Israel in Jerusalem lasts 33 years. So we're gonna hear the story of how David's capital moves from Hebron to Jerusalem. 33 years. How long was Jesus' life? 33 years, right? So some foreshadowing there. They didn't know this at the time when they were writing 2 Samuel, right? Also, too, I think this is fascinating. So I think if my math is correct, yeah. So, yeah, it is. So when David goes to Jerusalem, so he's in Hebron for 7 years. So when does he start in Jerusalem? About 1004 BC. And then he's got, 33 years, roughly, 1004, 1003, depending on what time of year, okay? Well, when David goes up and establishes his capital in Jerusalem and he's ruling over all of Israel, that is exactly 1,000 years before Christ is born. Because in the Middle Ages, they made a little bit of a miscalculation on the dates. So Jesus was actually, most scholars today think that Jesus was born sometime 3 to 4 BC. Jesus was born before Christ, ironically, right? By the time we realized the miscalculation, it was kind of too late. So symbolically, right, like the Jubilee of 2000 was 2,000 years after Christ was born, but actually he was born about 3 to 4 BC, most likely, right? So that means that when David went up to Jerusalem was exactly 1,000 years before Jesus was born. Really fascinating. Anyway, okay. Let's finish chapter 5 and then we'll end there for tonight. Okay. The last thing is we're going to see here, he's going to establish Jerusalem as his capital city. Okay. Verse 6, and the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, you will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off, thinking David cannot come in here. Okay, what's going on here? Well, first of all, a couple things about Jerusalem. Jerusalem was known as Salem in Genesis. We talked about Melchizedek. He was the king of Salem, okay, because he was the king of this area. Not just a king, priest king, right, Melchizedek. Okay, and then later it was called Jebus. And the Jebusites were a Canaanite tribe, and because of Jerusalem's extremely defensible position, it's a natural fortress because it's on a hill with some deep valleys on each side. It's hard to get up there. It's very, very defensible. So the Jebusites were one of the Canaanite tribes that held out the longest over the conquest of Israel. And at this time, they still occupied Jebus, Jerusalem. Okay, so they're still there. Now, why Jerusalem? Well, again, David, as a great military commander, very defensible position, ideal for a capital. Okay, obviously the Jebusites have been able to hold out there for a while now. Okay, also too, and we talked about this, but it's in neutral territory, or more so, it's between the northern tribes in Judah. If he keeps his capital in Hebron, that's a little bit too deep into Judah territory, right? So kind of like same ideas like Washington, D.C., The District of Columbia was a compromise between the North and the South, as like it's kind of in both places, right? Because the capital was originally in Philadelphia and then New York, right? Then they moved it down. So same kind of idea, right? You move it to a more neutral spot, so it's closer to the tribes in the north. Very defensible position. Okay. And then the other thing too, the Jebusites, and this is also symbolic, right? Because the Jebusites are kind of a holdout from the Canaanites. David's conquest of Jerusalem is symbolically like he's driven out the last of the Canaanites in the promised land, right? Because again, Joshua, when he came through here through Jericho, it was a process, right, to conquer all this land. The Jebusites are like the last stronghold of the Canaanite people. So symbolically, David is finishing a few, after a couple thousand years, or not thousand, a couple hundred years, he's finishing the project that Joshua started and fulfilling God's promises. Okay. One thing that Bishop Barron does really good in his book, and I probably haven't emphasized this enough, I will next time because it comes up more, is David was seen as a new Adam, establishing a new Eden, right? And so he's driving out from the garden, the new garden, right? The enemies of God, right? And we're going to see, we'll talk more about this next week, because basically where we're going to get to tonight is he's king now, right? But then we'll start talking about his reign, and he's going to start doing things that are Adamic, and that he's the new Adam, the new priest king of the new Garden of Eden. And I'll emphasize that a little more. But let's keep going. Okay, so then what do the Jebusites say? The Jebusites have this kind of goofy taunt, right? They're so cocky and confident. They say, "You will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off." In other words, blind and lame people will be able to defend this against you. Is what their taunt is. Okay, is basically what they're saying. Anyway, okay. So then, verse 7. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. This is the first time in the Bible that Zion is mentioned. Zion is part of the Ophel Ridge, which is in the southeastern part of Jerusalem. It's just south of the Temple Mount. I should have had a picture. I won't draw it for you, but it's a ridge on Jerusalem where David built his original city, the city of David. In modern old city in Jerusalem, it's on the southeastern edge of the city, just south of the Temple Mount. That's where David had his city. But even by Jesus' time, the city had extended into what's now called the Old City. And the city of David is to this day a section of the Old City of Jerusalem. In modern times, Jerusalem is now grown into a metropolis, right? But when you go into the old historic city, the city of Jesus' time, and then there's even history after that, but David's city is just a small section of that. I once saw a fact book that said that the city of David would fit in the Superdome. It wasn't very big, right? But it was very, very defensible. And the particular ridge that he established that original strong city on was called Mount Zion. Okay. Now later, Zion, it's the original site, very defensible. But Zion comes to represent all of Jerusalem. So you will hear in the Bible, shout for joy, Zion. And it's a representation of the whole city of Jerusalem, right? And really the whole people of Israel, okay? And then metaphorically, in the Old Testament, it's used to refer to God's people dwelling on God's holy mountain or holy stronghold, right? So Mount Zion becomes a type of heaven, right? I'm talking now about the spiritual sense of Scripture. The literal sense, Mount Zion was the ridge, the mount on which David built his original capital. The spiritual sense, though, it's God's stronghold, the place where God protects his people. And even more so spiritually, it's a symbol of heaven, right? The mountain of God, okay? I have a map here. Maybe next time I'll bring it up. But anyway, yeah, it's just south of the Temple Mount. Because remember, at this time, the temple hasn't been built yet. Solomon will build it, right? So David establishes his capital on Mount Zion, okay? And David said on that day, whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul. Therefore it is said, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house. And David dwelt in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David built the city round about from the Millo inward. We think that Millo was like a series of, or not a series, but a stone terrace that supported the city, right? So he built out from there. One thing that's and David became greater and greater, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. One thing that's, again, a detail that we get from Chronicles tells a little bit more about this story. So basically, what happens is we think what they're referring to is David tells his men to crawl up some kind of water shaft or a well, right? So they can get under and in the city and then open it, right? And there goes the stronghold of the Jebusites, right? The Chronicles gives us a little more detail about this episode. David tells his men, whoever is the first to strike against the Jebusites, I will reward as commander of my army. Well, guess who goes up and is the one who is like, yep, I'll do it. Goes up, strikes out, it's Joab. So Joab becomes the commander of David's armed forces. It probably explains, in part, the Chronicles story explains why David put up with Joab, because he was a really good warrior and really bold, right? And he puts up with his rashness and his hot-headedness because he's like, yeah, this guy will kind of go headlong into the breach, right? And he helps him defeat Jebus, or the Jebusites. Okay. Verse 11, and Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David, and cedar trees, also carpenters and masons who built David a house. And David perceived that the Lord had established him king over Israel, and that he exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. Hiram is the king of Tyre, Phoenicia, which is modern-day Lebanon. So he sends builders and supplies to build David's house, his palace, his literal house, his palace. The cedars of Lebanon, which you hear in Scripture, were renowned in their time, and I don't know, I guess today too. In fact, yeah, because the flag of Lebanon has a cedar of Lebanon, right? They were renowned for their great, building material, right? And so again, the king of Phoenicia, Hiram, he's recognizing David has become powerful. So again, it's a shrewd political move. Like, here, have some timber, some cedars of Lebanon, and some builders to build your house. But it also is spiritually, right? The spiritual sense. David is starting to gather not only the tribes but the nations to God, right? To the true God, which is part of his role. Okay. And then, so Tyre was an ancient seaport. It was still Gentile territory in Jesus' day. Jesus visited Tyre and Sidon. He actually uses them as an example when he says, woe to you, oh gosh, I'm blanking, Bethsaida, woe to you, what's the, I've been there. Sorry, I'm blanking. Anyway, woe to you, for Tyre and Sidon, if the deeds done there had happened, that they would have repented before you, right? They're Gentiles, right? He's saying, like, Jesus is saying to his own people, like, you guys aren't getting it. The Gentiles would get it, but you won't, right? And then also, too, the interesting thing about Hiram of king of Tyre will also help Solomon build the temple. So there's kind of a preview here of what's about to happen under Solomon. Verse 13, and David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem after he came from Hebron, and more sons and daughters were born to David. And these are the names of those who were born to him in Jerusalem: Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Eliada, and Ephelet. I'm probably butchering those Hebrew names, but anyway, okay, again, we already kind of talked about this. Like, I get it. It's barbaric in our time, but what is it saying about David, right? He is gaining power, prestige, right? And all these, some of these sons aren't going to be born yet, right? They're not being born right now, but he's forming alliances, right? He's consolidating power. He's building a house. Also, right, as spiritually, as the new Adam establishing the new Eden, he's following God's command to be fruitful and multiply, right? Again, children are a sign of God's blessing and abundance. And again, it was just the practice of the time, but it's, there is a kind of spiritual meaning attached to it. David, the Second Samuel says that David names a total of 19 sons of David. First Chronicles says that he had, Second Samuel says he has 17. Chronicles says that he had 19 total. And it doesn't count his daughters, and it doesn't count any children born to his concubines. Okay. So again, symbolically, he's the new Adam. Because again, the other thing too, and this is something that we don't really identify with, we do a little bit, but the prosperity of the king has to do with your prosperity as a nation. If the king's doing well, it means we're doing well, hopefully, right? In an ideal world, right? They identified there's a kind of national pride there, right? So if the king's not doing well, not good, because we're gonna get conquered pretty soon, right? Okay, last little bit here for tonight. So as you can imagine, the Philistines are not sitting idly by, right? They're noticing all this, right? And so they are going to try to nip David's reign in the bud. So this is kind of the last thing before David is like, he's the king, undisputed. Verse 17, when the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, all the Philistines went up in search of David, but David heard of it and went down to the stronghold. Notice, both practically, right, just from a military perspective, the Philistines have to go up, and David is at the stronghold working down. So advantage David, right? He has the high ground. Okay. Now the Philistines had come and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. Rephaim is a valley that kind of is southwest of Jerusalem and kind of is a little channel in the hill country of Judea that extends and then goes into the plains of Gath, or the plains of Philistia. So it's a kind of natural valley route up to Jerusalem. Okay, so the Philistines are like, this is not good, right? Like David is way too powerful. We need to go attack. We need to attack them. And David inquired of the Lord, shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand? Notice, what does David do? He prays, right? And the Lord said to David, go up, for I will certainly give the Philistines into your hand. And David came to Baal Perazim, and David defeated them there. And he said, the Lord has broken through my enemies before me like a bursting flood. Baal Perazim means Lord of breaking through. Notice also David uses flood imagery, which is evocative of the Exodus, right? Like the flood of Noah, right? But also the Red Sea, right? When Israel needed to be saved from their enemies, the sea went through. And David is using a flood as a metaphor because apparently the Philistines desperately were coming up this little valley that leads up to Jerusalem, and David's guys mow them down, right? And they don't, it's not really that hard. Therefore, the name of that place is called Baal Perazim. And the Philistines left their idols there, and David and his men carried them away. This is not just a throwaway detail, okay? Because again, what's the whole point of why these are God's chosen people? True worship, right? God wants true worshipers, right? God, the number one, ultimate sin in their time and our time is idolatry, right? Worshiping something that's not God. So this little line here about them picking up their idols, it's not just a throwaway line. It's like God is defeating, not defeating. He's doing away with idols, with idolatry through David, right? So spiritually, this is a really important line. Because the Philistines would bring idols as kind of good luck charms, right? Praying to their gods, right? But the fact that it mentions this is very intentional, right? Because David and his men collect them to burn them and destroy them. God is conquering idolatry through David. And that is the ultimate crime in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament, right? Every sin is a type of idolatry. Putting something as God that is not God, right? Okay. So that line is not a throwaway line, right? That God is accomplishing his purposes through David, right? True worship. And the Philistines, again, they know that this kingdom of David is not good news for them. So they're desperate. They try again. And the Philistines came up again and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. And when David inquired of the Lord, he said, you shall not go up, go around to their rear, and come upon them opposite the balsam trees. And when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, and bestir yourself, for then the Lord has gone out before you to strike the army of the Philistines. And David did as the Lord commanded him, and struck the Philistines from Geba to Gezer. I don't think those are on this map. Oh yeah, here. There's Gezer. Okay. So anyway, he ransacks them. It's a bloodbath, right? Here, again, what does David do? He prays. Okay. And God's a military genius, I guess, right? No, I mean, there's probably a combination, right? David's praying. He's inspired by God, right? Again, who knows? Like, it's not really important whether God, like, literally says to him in a voice, like, here, do this. Either way, David prays and he's inspired, right? And God inspires him to go, instead of going directly down the valley, to go around into the trees. And then God says the signal is when you hear the wind through the trees, right? There's a couple of things going on here. First, on a practical level, the wind through the trees gives them sound cover, right? And they ambush them and ransack them. The other thing, too, though, is that's symbolic of, like, the Lord and his army, right? What's the point here? Again, and this is the kind of creative tension, right, between the literal and the spiritual sense. And the authors of the biblical authors are very aware of this, that, like, there's things going on both levels here. You could explain those events, David's victory over in very, understandably human caused terms. But what is the author and David himself attributing the victory to? God, right? And symbolized by God is moving against the Philistines through the wind going through the trees, right? And that like, David is not giving credit to himself, right? And it's not David versus God. It's not like more of David, less of God, or more of God, less of David. It's both and, right? Because God doesn't relate to us in the same way that we relate to each other, right? If I want you to get you to do something, right, against your will, I have to force you to do it, right, from the outside. But God can work through the inside of human causes to accomplish his purposes. So it's both it is David's victory, but the whole point of 2 Samuel, what are we trying to do? We're trying to establish right praise, and all the glory and the credit goes to God. And so David, basically, this is more or less, I believe, the last time we really hear of the Philistines as a serious threat. I think they're still around a little bit, but David is now undisputed, unqualified. He is the king of all of United Israel. Okay, so I know that was a bit of kind of a trudge up the mountain, right? Literally up to Jerusalem. But now we'll get into kind of the covenant. Now that he's established in chapter 6, we'll talk about he's going to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, which is a very important event, and then God is going to establish his covenant. So we kind of followed David to his rise, but again, the whole kind of meta theme is, yes, it's a very fascinating story from a human perspective, but God is the one who is working through all these things, and he's the one who has blessed David to put David in the position where and it even says, right, that David realizes God perceived that the Lord had made him king for the sake of Israel, not for David, but for the whole people.